Welcome back to the Rabbit Hole Chronicles. I'm Percival Blackwood, and tonight we're walking the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London to examine history's most infamous unsolved murder case. But here's what they don't teach you in criminology class. What if Jack the Ripper was never caught not because he was brilliant, but because someone powerful didn't want him caught? What if the bungled investigation wasn't incompetence, but design? And what if the most famous serial killer in history never actually wrote a single letter claiming to be Jack the Ripper? Over the next hour, we're going to dissect the autumn of terror that gripped London in 1888. We'll examine the victims the world forgot, the suspects who should have been caught, and the cover-ups that may have let a killer walk free. And by the end, you might find yourself asking, was Jack the Ripper one man, multiple men, or something else entirely? A creation of the very forces meant to stop him. To understand Jack the Ripper, you first need to understand Whitechapel in 1888. Imagine the worst slum you can think of, then make it darker, more crowded, and fill it with 80,000 desperate souls. In Whitechapel, over half of all children died before their 5th birthday. The annual homicide rate was 40 per 1,000 people, 4 times the London average. Cries of murder in the night were so common that people stopped investigating them. This wasn't a neighbourhood, it was a pressure cooker of human misery. The police force assigned to this powder keg. Each division of the Metropolitan Police had fewer than 550 constables for 176,000 people. That's one officer for every 320 residents. Of those 550, only 15 were detectives. 15, for an area where violent crime was as common as coal smoke. Into this chaos came waves of immigrants, Irish labourers, Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms. By 1888, tensions were at a breaking point. The previous year saw Bloody Sunday riots in Trafalgar Square. Anti-Semitic violence was common. The establishment viewed Whitechapel as a necessary evil, a place to contain London's unwanted. This is crucial context because when the murders began, the response from authorities wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about controlling a narrative, preventing riots, and maintaining the social order. And sometimes, maintaining order is more important to those in power than solving murders. Between August 31st and November 9th, 1888, 5 women were murdered in a distinctive pattern that suggested a single killer. These are known as the canonical 5, though the real number of victims may be higher. Let me tell you about these women, not as nameless prostitutes, which is how Victorian society dismissed them, but as human beings. Mary Ann Polly Nichols, 43 years old, found August 31st in Bucks Row. She'd been seen alive just 30 minutes earlier. Her throat was cut so deeply it nearly decapitated her. Her abdomen was ripped open, intestines exposed. The violence was so extreme that the examining doctor said the killer must have some anatomical knowledge. Annie Chapman, 47, killed September 8th in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. This time the mutilation went further. The killer removed her uterus with surgical precision and took it with him. A witness saw her with a man 30 minutes before her death, described as shabby genteel in a dark overcoat. Despite this description, no arrest was made. Elizabeth Stride, 45, murdered September 30th, the first victim of what became known as the double event. Her throat was cut, but unlike the others, there was no mutilation. Most investigators believe the killer was interrupted. Multiple witnesses saw her with a man that evening, but their descriptions varied wildly, almost as if they were describing different people. Catherine Eddowes, 46, killed the same night as Stride, just 45 minutes later and a mile away. The killer had time here. He removed her left kidney and uterus, mutilated her face beyond recognition. A witness named Joseph Lawender saw her with a fair-haired, shabby man minutes before her death. This description would become important later. And then something extraordinary happened. As the killer fled the Eddowes scene, he dropped a piece of her bloodied apron in Goulston Street. Above it, chalked on the wall, was a message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Stop and think about that. Here's the first real clue, the killer's only confirmed message. What did the police do? Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered it washed off before dawn. Before it could be photographed, before most investigators could even see it. The official reason? Preventing anti-Jewish riots. But Warren's decision destroyed the only physical evidence the killer left behind. Either Warren was catastrophically incompetent, or he had other priorities besides catching the Ripper. Mary Jane Kelly, 25, the youngest and last canonical victim, murdered November 9th in her own room at Miller's Court. This was different. The killer had privacy and time. The mutilation was so extreme that veteran police surgeons were horrified. Her heart was missing, taken as a trophy. The fire in her room had been stoked so hot it melted a kettle, suggesting the killer needed light for his work or was destroying evidence. After Kelly's murder, the killing stopped. Abruptly. Completely. As if someone had flipped a switch. The police response was the largest manhunt in Victorian history. Over 2,000 people interviewed, 300 suspects investigated, 80 detained, and yet somehow they caught no one. Inspector Frederick Aberline, an experienced Whitechapel detective, led the investigation. He was competent, thorough, and by all accounts desperate to catch the killer. So why didn't he? Consider the investigation's strange failures. The police had witness descriptions. Multiple people saw the victims with men shortly before their deaths. Joseph Lawender's description of Eddowes' companion was particularly detailed. Yet no systematic effort was made to match these descriptions to known criminals or local residents. The killer showed anatomical knowledge, removing organs with precision. How many people in Whitechapel had such skills? Doctors, medical students, butchers, slaughterhouse workers. This should have narrowed the field considerably. It didn't. The murders all occurred within a small area, suggesting local knowledge. The killer knew which alleys were dark, which streets were patrolled when, where he could work undisturbed. Again, this should have helped narrow suspects. It didn't. But here's the truly suspicious part. Years later, we learned that senior police officials believed they knew who the Ripper was. In 1894, Assistant Chief Constable Melville McNagton wrote a private memo naming 3 main suspects. But this memo wasn't discovered until 1959. Why was it hidden? Montague John Druitt, a barrister from a respectable family who committed suicide in December 1888, right after the murders stopped. McNagton claimed Druitt's own family suspected him. But here's the problem. Druitt was playing cricket in Dorset during at least one murder. McNagton got basic facts wrong about him, his age, his profession. It's almost as if Druitt was named to deflect attention from someone else. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish hairdresser living in Whitechapel. Sir Robert Anderson, Assistant Commissioner, later claimed they knew Kosminski was the Ripper. According to Anderson, a witness identified him but refused to testify because both men were Jewish. This is extraordinary. The head of the investigation claims they solved the case but couldn't prosecute because of Jewish solidarity? It sounds like a convenient excuse. And why didn't they at least keep Kosminski under surveillance? He lived freely in Whitechapel until being institutionalised in 1891. Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man McNagton, also named. Except Ostrog was in prison in France during the murders, How does the assistant chief constable name someone with an airtight alibi? Unless the point wasn't to identify the real killer, but to provide plausible alternatives. And then there's the suspect McNacton didn't name, but who keeps surfacing in the historical record. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, grandson of Queen Victoria. The prince was first linked to the case in the 1960s, but the theory goes deeper. He supposedly had syphilis, which caused madness. He allegedly frequented Whitechapel's brothels. Some versions claim the murders were actually committed by his doctor, Sir William Gull, to cover up a royal scandal. The royal theory is usually dismissed because the prince had alibis. But consider this. Would anyone in 1888 have dared seriously investigate Queen Victoria's grandson? Would police records showing his involvement have survived, or would they have been destroyed, like that message on the wall? In 2019, DNA testing on a shawl, allegedly from the Edaf's crime scene, supposedly identified Kosminski. But the shawl's provenance is questionable. There's no record of it in 1888. The DNA was mitochondrial, shared by thousands of people, and the scientist who did the testing later couldn't produce his data for verification. It's almost as if someone wanted to definitively pin it on the conveniently dead, conveniently powerless Kosminski. Here's where our story takes a fascinating turn. Jack the Ripper, that name that's echoed through history, first appeared in a letter to the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. The Dear Boss letter, written in red ink, taunted police and promised to clip the lady's ears off. The police initially dismissed it as a hoax. Then Eddowes was found with part of her earlobe cut. Suddenly the letter seemed genuine. The police published it, and Jack the Ripper was born. But here's what they don't tell you. Most experts now believe the Dear Boss letter was written by a journalist, possibly Tom Bullen of the Central News Agency itself. The handwriting doesn't match any suspect. The language is too polished for an East End killer. It reads like what a newspaper man thinks a killer would write. Think about what this means. The most famous serial killer in history, the name that's terrified people for over a century, was possibly invented by a journalist to sell newspapers. Over 300 letters claiming to be from Jack followed. The Saucy Jackie postcard. The From Hell letter that came with half a kidney. But if the original was fake, how many others were? The From Hell letter is interesting because it's different. Crude handwriting, bad spelling, and it came with what might have been Catherine Eddowes' kidney. But even this could have been procured by a medical student from a mortuary. And conveniently, both the letter and kidney were lost by police. The letters created Jack the Ripper as a character. Taunting, brilliant, uncatchable. They turned a sordid series of murders into a gothic thriller. They sold newspapers and deflected attention from police failures. But most importantly, they created a mythology that obscured the truth. Instead of looking for a local man with anatomical knowledge and serious mental illness, everyone was looking for the phantom who wrote eloquent, taunting letters. After Mary Kelly's murder, the canonical Ripper killings ceased. No gradual decline, no geographical shift. They just stopped. Serial killers don't typically stop, unless they're dead, imprisoned, or institutionalized. So what happened to Jack? Theory 1. He committed suicide. Montague Druitt killed himself weeks later, but the timing's too convenient, and he had that alibi. Theory 2. He was institutionalized. Kosminski was committed in 1891, but that's 3 years later. Why the gap? Theory 3. He was quietly dealt with. If the killer was connected to powerful people, perhaps he was secretly executed or exiled. No trial, no scandal. Problem solved. Theory 4. He was protected. What if the killer was someone whose exposure would damage the establishment? Someone who was spirited away after Kelly's murder went too far. Consider this. After November 9th, several senior police officials resigned or were reassigned. Commissioner Warren resigned November 8th, the day before Kelly's murder. Coincidence? Or did he know something was coming and wanted out?
Song about a girl who is the dream eater.
In recent decades, criminal profilers and geographic analysts have studied the case with modern techniques. Their conclusions are telling geographic profiling places the killer's likely residence near Flower and Dean Street, exactly where Kosminski lived, but also where hundreds of others lived. FBI profilers described the killer as a local white male, 20s to 30s, with anatomical knowledge and a hatred of women. This describes dozens of Whitechapel residents in 1888. DNA testing has been attempted multiple times. The results? Inconclusive at best, fraudulent at worst. The 2019 Kosminski DNA study couldn't be verified. Tests on letters showed the writer might have been female. Every scientific attempt to solve the case has raised more questions than answers. It's almost as if the evidence was contaminated, destroyed, or fabricated from the very beginning. As if someone wanted to ensure this case would never be definitively solved. Jack the Ripper became the template for every serial killer that followed. The taunting letters, the media circus, the police failures, it all started here. But in creating the legend of Jack, we've forgotten the victims. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They became props in a story about a phantom. Their poverty, their struggles, their humanity, all overshadowed by the myth of their killer. The Ripper has been portrayed as everything from a mad doctor to a member of the royal family. There are Ripper tours, museums, merchandise. We've turned a brutal killer of desperate women into entertainment. And perhaps that was always the point. Transform a series of squalid murders that exposed Victorian London's cruel indifference to its poor into a thrilling mystery. Make the killer the star, not the victims. Focus on the who, not the why. Because the WHI is uncomfortable. Why were these women so vulnerable? Why did nobody care until they were dead? Why was preserving social order more important than catching their killer? Here's my theory, based on the evidence. Jack the Ripper was a local man with medical knowledge and severe mental illness. He might have been Aaron Kosminski or someone like him. The police probably identified him relatively quickly. Anderson and Swanson's later claims suggest as much. But something prevented an arrest. Maybe the killer had connections to someone important. Maybe he was an informant. Maybe prosecuting him would have exposed police corruption or incompetence. Or maybe, in the powder keg of 1888 Whitechapel, authorities feared that arresting a Jewish immigrant for the murders would spark pogroms. So they let him walk. They destroyed evidence like the Goulston Street graffiti. They floated false suspects like Druitt. They let journalists create the myth of Jack the Ripper to distract from their failure. When the killer became too dangerous after Kelly's murder, he was quietly dealt with, institutionalised, exiled, or eliminated. The case was closed without being solved, and the legend was allowed to grow, obscuring the truth forever. The Ripper's real legacy. Jack the Ripper wasn't caught because someone didn't want him caught. The investigation failed because it was meant to fail. The evidence disappeared because it was destroyed. the mystery endures because it was engineered to endure. The real crime wasn't just the murder of 5 women, it was the transformation of their tragedy into entertainment. It was the decision to protect the system rather than seek justice. It was choosing order over truth. Today we have Ripper tours and museums. We debate suspects and analyse DNA. We've made Jack the Ripper immortal. But Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly remain dead and largely forgotten. The establishment that failed them in life failed them again in death. And we continue that failure every time we focus on the myth of Jack, rather than the reality of what Victorian London did to its most vulnerable citizens. Jack the Ripper was never caught because Jack the Ripper was useful, as a distraction, as a legend, as a way to avoid asking harder questions about poverty, police corruption, and institutional failure. The fog that shrouded Whitechapel in 1888 has never really lifted. It just changed form, from London fog to the fog of mythology, conspiracy, and convenient lies. That's our episode for today. The Rabbit Hole Chronicles is an independent production. We believe that examining history's mysteries requires looking not just at what happened, but at who benefits from the official story.